Well, thank you, Pastor, for the introduction. Again, my name is Ilya or Elijah. We've come to the United States about 2.5 years ago. We moved to Orlando, Florida, because this is where our ministry is based, located. Our ministry was started in 1994, but my ministry leader used to be a creation science teacher for a long time before he started the ministry officially. So obviously you hear that I speak differently from you, therefore I have to ask this question. Do you understand me using your language? Okay? The little ones, do you understand me? Can you understand me when I speak? No, you, don't turn around. I'm talking to you. Can you understand me all right? Okay. So a little more details concerning my family. We've been married. This year, our marriage is going to turn 28. We're going to celebrate the 28th anniversary of our marriage. And we got married actually even before we came to the Lord. We got married when both myself and my wife were 17, just 17 years old. But we've known each other for years. We had known each other for years before we actually got married. We went to the same kindergarten. And we went to the same school for 5 years. And actually we were classmates for 5 years. We were dating through the last year of school, of high school, and we got married right after we graduated from the high school. We came to the Lord in 1995. It was a great time of revival, both in Ukraine and in Russia. And we came to the Lord in a church which is very similar to yours, or to this church, if you are not a part of this church. And I started serving the Lord immediately. I always preached the word in the church, various aspects of the word. And then the Lord led us to become missionaries in the Balkans. We went to the nation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and stayed there for 3.5 years, ministering to the people, helping a local leader to plant a new church. Then we came back to Russia, and about 14 and a half years ago, we moved to Ukraine. And the last 12 years before coming to the States, we spent in the city of Kherson. If you know where that city is, it's the southernmost region of Ukraine, bordering with the Crimea Peninsula. But I've been involved with this ministry and with this sort of ministry since 2004. So I started as a mere interpreter, but since I have both scientific and theological background, I became a very good candidate for this sort of ministry to continue it on, and I started doing my own presentations on creation science back in 2012. So that's enough of an introduction. I would like to talk to you very briefly today, just basically giving you some highlights of two subjects. First of all, we will talk about fossils, about the remains of organisms which once lived on this planet. And we will see that these fossils actually testify to the flood of Noah rather than to the slow and gradual evolution from molecule to people. And when you will be hearing me talking about evolution, you have to know something. We all know that animals do change from one generation to the next generation. We know, for example, that from a single pair of cats or cat-like animals that came from the Ark of Noah, we got all the cats which now inhabit the earth. Tigers, domestic cats, lions, leopards, and all the other cats. So obviously, modern cats are not the same. They're very different from each other. There are some basic similarities between them. Where's my tumbler with my water? Okay. They are very different, but their basic body plan is the same. So we know that over hundreds of years and thousands of years and even decades. Yes? Oh, thank you so much. I'm so thankful to you that you allow me to finish speaking. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Can we wait to the very end of the presentation to ask questions? No, please do your best, okay? So we know that animals can change through over decades and hundreds of years and thousands of years. But those changes always produce the animals of the same kind. So we do not deny. Thank you for your patience. I really appreciate that. We do not deny that animals change, but changes do not mean evolution that is able to produce people from single-celled organisms. So this is what I will be talking about when talking about evolution, okay? Evolution, in my terms, will be evolution from single-celled organisms to humans. And let's talk about the fossils. What are fossils? Fossils are remains of organisms or traces of organisms that we find in different places. Typically, fossils are bones, pieces of wood, shells, which became mineralized or saturated with minerals. But there are many other types of fossils. For example, molds, casts, carbon films. This is an example of a carbon film. Insects trapped in amber. Animal trapped in ice. Animal that became mummified rather than permineralized or saturated with stone. Fossils can be organisms. Fossils can be organisms trapped in tar. And there are very interesting fossils like trace fossils, fossilized preserved footprints, or stomach stones, or fossilized droppings. Fossilized droppings are technically called coprolites, and they are very useful to determine what was the diet of the animal which dropped them. Technically, we could classify coal and oil as fossils as well, because they are the remains of living organisms. Almost all fossils are found in sedimentary rocks. What are sedimentary rocks? To put it in simple terms, sedimentary rocks are dried out mud that turned into stone. There are several types of sedimentary rocks, but basically all those rocks were mud in the past. And flood conditions, big floods or small floods or global floods, are the ideal conditions both for eroding continents, for creating mud, for transporting mud, for depositing mud across vast areas, and the same conditions are ideal for fossilization. Another interesting fact is that fossilization requires rapid burial, and fossils do not typically form today. At the beginning of the 19th century, there were estimated 50 to 60 million American bison or buffaloes that were roaming the prairies, but hardly any leftovers, any remains of those bisons or buffaloes survived till our days. It tells us that the conditions that are conducive to fossilization are not present in our world today at the same scales as they existed in the past. A dead animal is quickly destroyed by the elements and by the microorganisms. Therefore, to get a fossil, you need to get a dead organism buried very rapidly. During a flood, and I will try to make a case that it was mostly the global flood in the days of Noah, plants and animals were suddenly trapped under loads of mud. And they were preserved in those mud layers, and those mud layers protected the organisms so that they can survive till our days. There are many indications that the burial was very rapid. First of all, to completely cover a large animal, it requires that the burial should be very rapid. But if you look at this ichthyosaur mama was buried while delivering a baby. There are a couple of other babies in her insides, but she was trapped in labor. So this process was very rapid, very sudden. Also, there are lots of fossil graveyards, bones of dinosaurs, bones of other creatures with plants are all buried together in mass graves. Only in this wall you can count more than 1,500 different bones belonging to different animals. This is a wall in a quarry visitor center at the Dinosaur National Monument in Colorado. So not only the burial was rapid, as is evidenced from the fossils, but the process of fossilization itself, that is, turning of a living organism into stone, is actually a rapid process. It doesn't require millions of years. It requires only the right conditions. For example, this hat became fossilized in about 40 years. We make a joke about this hat, calling it a hatasaurus. And this particular hatasaurus is a Fedorasaurus, and it was found in the island of Tasmania. And there is another hatasaurus called Bolosaurus, and this Bolosaurus was buried during an eruption of a volcano in New Zealand in 1886. And that hat was fossilized in about 60 years, less than 60 years. And you may tell me, okay, but these are not living organisms. What about getting living organisms fossilized? Well, next to this Hatasaurus, next to this Bolosaurus, there was found a complete Hemosaurus, a completely fossilized piece of pork. So, even living organisms get fossilized very quickly. This fish was found in Brazil, and the paleontologist who found it claimed that it got fossilized in about 5 hours, or even faster. How did he know that? The thing is that even the gills of this fish were preserved. The gills, as any fisherman will tell you, I'm not a good fisherman. I went fishing several times, maybe 5 or 6 times, caught nothing. Therefore, I cannot verify this information. But the pastor is an experienced fisherman, aren't you? Okay.
Almost as good as you.
Well, what about those stories that you told me? What about those stories that you told me? It doesn't matter. But gills disintegrate faster than any other part of the fish when you take it out of water and leave it on land. But this fish was fossilized so quickly that even gills were preserved. These are the remains of a limestone cowboy. This cowboy, or whoever it was, died no earlier than 1950, because this particular model of shoes was produced between the years 1950 and 1952. So he couldn't have died before 1950. His remains were found in 1980, and what remained of him became fossilized in less than 30 years. So fossilization is a rapid process. Now, fossils are typically found in groups. Organisms are found together with other organisms. For example, heavy-shelled organisms such as seashells, trilobites, horseshoe crabs can often be found together. And this group of organisms were called the Cambrian organisms. Another group comprises land-dwelling dinosaurs, which is a tautology. Dinosaurs are all land-dwelling by definition. Cycad plants, ammonites, they also are often found together. There are 12 major groups of organisms that are typically found together. And these 12 groups gave names to 12 geologic systems. What are geologic systems? A geologic system is a number of layers of rock containing a particular group of organisms. So it doesn't matter whether that's sandstone or mudstone, limestone or shale. If a particular rock contains particular fossils, it is classified as a particular geologic system. And there is a great similarity between these fossil groups and modern life zones. For example, in America there are forests, and in a forest we can find oaks with squirrels, with woodpeckers. We expect to find them in the same location. This life zone is called the American forest. There is another life zone, African grassland, and there we expect to find grasses, lions, and zebras in approximately the same location because they live together, they belong together, they have certain relationships between each other. And it's very hard to deny the similarity between fossil groups of organisms and groups of organisms inhabiting particular life zones. So these 12 geologic systems are usually stacked on top of each other, with the Cambrian, which I already mentioned, in the very bottom, and with the Quaternary at the very top. So there are 12 geologic systems on top of each other in a particular order from the bottom to the top. But there are two different interpretations of this order of layers. First of all, let me tell you that that column, this is called the geologic column, the 12 layers stacked in a certain order, that column actually, most probably, it does not exist in nature. It exists in textbooks, it exists as a mental construct, it exists as a diagram. That's why I will be calling it geologic column diagram. Actually, the layers exist in the ground and the fossils exist in the layers, but those layers are spread around the globe. So in order to construct that geologic column, they take a couple of layers from North America, a couple of layers from Australia, a couple of layers from Europe, a couple of layers from Asia, and they put them in a certain order. But we will call it geologic column diagram. There are two different explanations, conflicting explanations for these layers of organisms and sediments that contain them. The first explanation is the one that you most often hear in school. This is a representation of evolution from very simple first organisms to the most complex humans. This is a record, according to this interpretation, of a slow and gradual accumulation of sediments and fossils in them. But there is another interpretation. For example, The Cambrian represents the sea creatures, which were the first to appear on the earth, and they lived supposedly, according to this interpretation, 550 to roughly 500 million years ago. The other group that we mentioned, the Jurassic organisms, according to this interpretation, there was life both in the sea and on the land back to 100 and 150 million years ago, according to this interpretation. And those creatures lived after some 340 to 300 million years after the Cambrian organisms. So they lived in different times. But another explanation, the creationist explanation for the geologic column diagram, is that all those organisms lived at the same time, but in different places, in different life zones. And those layers and those fossils are a record of a burial of those organisms, fast burial and fast accumulation of sediments during the Noah's flood. Now, if we look at the fossils from a bird's eye perspective, 75 to 80% of the surface of the land is covered with dried out mud layers which turned into stone, which contain trillions of buried plants and animals. So does that sound like a result of slow and gradual accumulation of sediments over hundreds of millions of years, or does that sound more like a result of a rapid global flood? Well, we think, not everybody agrees with us, but we think, and when I say we, I mean creation scientists who are experts in their respective scientific fields, geologists, astronomers, paleontologists, biologists, marine biologists, ecologists. There are hundreds of Christian teachers, professors, and scientists, many of them are PhDs, who reject the idea of evolution from molecule to man and who support the biblical idea of creation and the flood. So when I say we, I do not rely on my own authority, because my own authority and my own expertise is from different scientific fields. But I'm just an educator who relies on the authority and the materials produced by major scientists in their respective fields. So the fossil evidence is best understood, as we think, as trillions of dead plants and animals which drowned in a recent global flood. And the fossils also tell us that the world which existed before the flood was very different. First of all, many organisms were larger. Of course, larger does not necessarily mean better, because smaller animals, for example, are better suited to surviving during droughts and famines and in some hard conditions. But when we look at the fossils, we know that the fossils were bigger, the organisms that lived before the flood and got fossilized were much bigger than their modern counterparts. Probably before the flood, the atmospheric pressure was higher than today. First of all, there were giant flying reptiles which would have an extreme difficulty get into the air, get to flight, get off the ground in the present-day atmosphere. But if the atmospheric pressure was higher in the past, it would be easier for them to live, to survive, and to fly. Then some dinosaurs have chests whose lung capacity is too small, and they would experience great difficulty if they had to breathe in the modern atmosphere. Also, the atmosphere before the flood probably was richer in oxygen. Maybe several percent richer than today. We derive that conclusion from studying bubbles trapped in amber. Some of them have approximately the same content of oxygen as in today's atmosphere, but some of them contain more oxygen. And also, the climate near the poles in the north and in the south was much warmer than today. Mammoths were able to live very far north. You know, I grew up in the Arctic. And I will tell you, when the temperature in the Arctic gets below -30, you have to cover your small nose with a woolen scarf if you don't want it to be frostbitten. Now imagine how those mammoths with those trunks instead of small noses could withstand that sort of cold. It's not possible. The climate was much milder, much warmer in the north and also in the south. There was lush vegetation, and there were even dinosaurs living in Antarctica before the flood. Those two are artistic representations of two kinds of dinosaurs which were found in Antarctica. So the Earth before the flood was very different. Something happened, like a major catastrophe, which disrupted that world and changed it into what we are having today. So let's talk about the lowest layers and the lowest organisms in those layers. Below the Cambrian, we find very few fossils at all. But in the Cambrian, suddenly, as if from nowhere, there appear all basic body plans that we still see on the Earth today. So, for example, worms and people are obviously built according to two very different body plans. There are about 26, but it's very difficult to say because different scientists offer different classifications, different systems of pigeonholing the living organisms. But they say that there are, let's say, 25, 30 different basic body plans of animals, and all those body plans appear suddenly as if from nowhere in the Cambrian. After the Cambrian, we find no new body plans at all. This event, this sudden appearance of multicellular complex life, is called the Cambrian explosion. And this is a powerful testimony that living organisms actually did not evolve slowly and gradually, but were suddenly created, and they were well designed from the very beginning. Because if we look at the evolutionary explanation for all the life forms that we have on the Earth today, the first organisms have to be very simple. There should be few of them, and they have to slowly and gradually evolve into higher and higher, more and more complex life forms. Well, it was suggested that there were ancestors to the Cambrian animals, but they were not preserved, perhaps because they did not have shells that were shells that can be easily preserved. Maybe some people hypothesized those organisms, the ancestors, the supposed ancestors of the Cambrian animals, did exist, but they were soft-bodied, and therefore their fossils were not preserved. But actually, we found some multicellular organisms, even in the lower layers, lower than the Cambrian, but they are not related to the Cambrian animals. They are not simple, they are very complex, they are obviously very well designed, and they are soft-bodied. Therefore, even soft-bodied organisms can be preserved. The world's oldest fossils are called stromatolites. They are mats produced by cyanobacteria, which are also called blue-green algae. These organisms make their own food from sunlight and seawater. They